Father Kirill is recording in progress. Good. Next month, Father Kirill is talking to us about Matins and some of the Lenten texts for that. That's on, I think, the 4th of April. The month after, in May, Bishop Raphael of Ilion, one of our assistant bishops, is going to speak about Saints Raphael, Nicholas, and Irene of Lesbos. Tonight, however, we are a little bit closer to home. My good chum, Father Mark Tattum-Smith, is about to tell us about his research into the British saints. I think I'll hand straight over to him.
Thank you very much. Botolf, if I can call you that, in our ecclesiastical setting. So, hello. Very nice to meet you all and to be invited to your, is it called a study group? Was that the right title?
Yes, this week.
Okay. So, just a few words of introduction about me. I'm Father Mark Tattum-Smith. I'm a deacon assigned to a small parish in the middle of the North Suffolk countryside, not too far from Norwich, if you've heard of that city in the east of England. The church is a purpose-built Russian Orthodox church, which is in the grounds of Deacon Andrew Bond's house. Deacon Andrew, of course, been running, some of you may know already, has been running the St. George Orthodox Information Service now for more than, I think it must be approaching 50 years now, if not more than that. Over 10 years ago now, he established, together with his late wife, Mary, a purpose-built church in the extensive grounds of his house. And yeah, so I have the privilege to serve there. I've been Orthodox for, trying to think now, I think 17 years, and was received into the church by the former priest Andrew Phillips. There's at the church St. John the Wonder Worker in Felixstowe in Suffolk. In my secular life, I'm an adults social worker. Yes, I think that's probably will be an adequate summary of where I am and where I come from. So I've been invited really to talk about the veneration of the British saints, and in particular the saints of the British Isles liturgical project that I've been involved with. So I think I'll start with a bit of a history about where the origin of this project came from, say a little about the structure of the project, what we found so far. I'd then like to kind of share some of see if you've got some ideas really around some of the problems that we're already encountering in the project. And then I'll end on a slightly more, I hope, inspiring note about what you can do in terms of furthering the veneration of the British saints. So the project, the liturgical project for the British saints kind of started from acute sense of frustration that I had. For many years, I was the choir master before. I'm now serving in the Holy Altar, but for many years I was serving on the Kleros as the choir master at our church, which is a very small church, incidentally, a small congregation. We mostly, pretty much all of our services are in English, though we just try to introduce little bits of Church Slavonic or Romanian on occasions, depending upon who's present. But something that I was finding that was very frustrating, kind of week in, week out, was when, for example, I'd go to prepare the Vespers service and would be following usually we use the St. Innocents liturgical calendar. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that's one that's very prominent within the Russian church, that essentially gives you the breakdown about how many stichira you should use at Vespers, and at matins, that, you know, where you should insert the troparia and so on and so forth. But often I'd find it would be the feast of a great British saint on a Sunday, and would hope there might be some mention of it within the liturgical calendar, only to find that there wasn't any mention of it, and instead there was the liturgical provision was made for perhaps a fairly minor saint that I hadn't heard of before, and might come from a fairly obscure part of Cappadocia or of deepest Russia. And that struck me really as being rather tragic, in the sense that the great wealth of saints of the British Isles, whose spiritual heirs we are, have left such a legacy for us, both in terms of their lives as well as their works. So many of them struggled against, spiritually struggled against paganism. Many of them suffered martyrdom for the Orthodox faith, and built up a distinctive Orthodox culture that stretched back to the times of the apostles, and formed a continuous chain up until the Great Schism, or more, perhaps others might say the Norman conquest in the mid-11th century. So we are their heirs. We obviously, in the landscape that surrounds us, we can learn something about them, and yet within the formal liturgical structure of our church services and our church calendars, although again in some of the calendars you might get a mention of British saints, it was a source of frustration that it was very difficult to actually have a full service to one of the British saints. And I suppose it was that frustration really that led me to talk to my bishop, Bishop Irénée, about this lack really of kind of adequate liturgical provision to enable really just the basic veneration of the Orthodox saints, and to ensure that they are an organic part of the life of our worshipping communities and the cycle of divine services. Having spoken to him about it, it's Vladika that essentially structured and set a kind of a way forward for the liturgical project. And I think actually I should also mention that I think there's an important missiological or missionary kind of facet to all of this, in the sense that many people look at the Orthodox Church as it is manifested today and are just very much struck of its foreignness, either because of the languages used in the church service. They might make superficial judgments about people attending those services and conclude that actually this isn't a church for the people of this country, but is rather for a church for Greeks or a church for Romanians or for whatever kind of ethnic hue that the local Orthodox Church kind of might be primarily serving. So I think that actually, again, another driver really around this was also the sense that actually an important way in which we could counter that perception, that facile kind of objection, is through ensuring that we do have a proper regard for the native saints, if you like, of this land, of this place, and that's adequately reflected, again, within our liturgical worshipping life. And as a result of that, people could not just simply dismiss Orthodoxy as just being for Russians, when actually that there are, full services to St. Cuthbert or to St. Edward or to St. Edmund or whoever. So on the 20th of May, 2020, Vladika sent a very long decree, which I think is 23E 2020, and essentially suggested that we divide this project of essentially gathering and enabling a proper round of kind of official services to the British saints to be formed. Liturgica suggested that we should divide the project into 7. The first part being the research and collation of what he called a master index. This is in itself a very ambitious project. So Liturgica has given me, and also another deacon in our diocese who is also another co-chair of this project. He's also amusingly not only a deacon but also called Mark. He's given us the job of compiling all the known hymnography to the British saints, as well as indicating the gaps where there is no liturgical provision. I think it's fair to say that just that first part of the project will probably take me the rest of my life to adequately finish, and probably something that I'll probably pass on to my own children or to whoever is bold enough or silly enough, perhaps foolish enough to take up the challenge. So the first stage is this creation of this index of what all the liturgical materials we have to the British saints so far, as well as indicating the British saints for whom we have no liturgical provision. The second phase he suggested should be the editing of these liturgical materials, and that would be against a common house style and with a consistent idiom of liturgical English. And we'll say a little bit more about that later, but that in itself is a source of huge controversy. Phase 3 would be the publication of the electronic texts once those have been finalized and approved. The fourth phase, Liturgica suggested, should be the authoring of introductory lives to the saints. And I think he means just a kind of a simple one-pager giving an overview of the life of the saints. But again, as we'll see, that's also not a simple thing. The fifth phase of the project is the presentation to the Holy Synod, which is perhaps the simplest of these steps, I think. The sixth phase is the commissioning of the new services, whereby, again, those liturgical gaps have been established. We'll be able to hopefully commission new services to be composed to those saints. And the seventh phase is the creation of a liturgical rubric to assist those who are wanting to incorporate liturgical services to the British saints into their round of the cycle of divine services, particularly when this is combined with the existing commemoration in terms of the Octoikos. That's the cycle of the 8 tones around the resurrection, as well as any other festal hymnography that might also have to be employed alongside the millennium commemoration of the British saints. So we have a way forward. We have a high-level plan divided into 7, but as I hope you will see, this is by no means an easy challenge, and certainly, just as I said, the first step alone is going to take a very long time, and the editing and compiling of lives, as well as the editing of the services, is also going to be immensely challenging. It's important to say, though, that I think we're also building on some good foundations. That is the work of previous generations of Orthodox Christians to develop liturgical materials to the saints of these lands, and indeed one of the composers of some liturgical hymnody has been Reader Anthony himself, who's on the call this evening, I see. So I just thought I'd sketch a little bit, perhaps, about the history of, if you like, the liturgical authors, the liturgical composers, and how much work has already been done that we've discovered through this process of fulfilling Liturgica's first phase of this collation of this master index, which is already a very unruly Excel spreadsheet. I think, and again, be interesting to see if anyone disagrees with this, but I think perhaps the starting point, I think, for the gathering and creation of liturgical material to the British saints, at least within the Orthodox Church. There was also there was actually some important anticipation of this, perhaps within the kind of Anglo-Catholic movement that was also very much involved with it in the Anglican Church, with the collation of hagiography to the British saints. Sabine Baring-Gould, Cardinal Newman, for example, were very much dedicated to that. But within an Orthodox context and within the Orthodox Church, I think this movement can be, or arguably could be dated to following the example of Vladika St. John Maximovich, or St. John the Wonder Worker, as he's also known, who is a great saint of the Russian Church abroad, of which I'm part, and his incorrupt relics can be seen in the Cathedral of the Joy of All Who Sorrow in San Francisco. But as well as, and he's often known as St. John of Shanghai in San Francisco, something that is lesser known is that he was also for, I think, 12 years, resident in Western Europe. I think he spent much of his time in Paris and in Brussels. But between 1950 and 1962, St. John also spent time in London, visiting the cathedral and also the convent in London, and the small kind of emigre community that was here. But we do know that throughout his life, Vladika St. John was a great champion for the Orthodox emigres finding themselves following the Bolshevik Revolution in the diaspora, to realize the holiness of the place that God had sent them to, whether they were dwelling in exile, whether they were dwelling in exile in France, in Germany, or in Great Britain, in England. Vladika was very insistent that Orthodox should get to know the ancient saints of the lands which God had taken them to. And wherever he went, Vladika was well known, St. John was well known for gathering whatever he could find about the saints. So he would go and research the lives of the saints, go into libraries, make copies and photocopies of the text that he could find. He would use the general millennium to have services to these saints, and greatly encouraged both on the continent as well as in this country, Orthodox in communities in Europe to learn more about these saints and to start developing authentic Orthodox veneration for these saints. So I think that Vladika was certainly, Vladika St. John was an extremely important influence. And within the church abroad, following the departure of Vladika to San Francisco, where he completed his archpastoral ministry, the next bishop of in this country was Archbishop Nicodim, Vladika Nicodim Nagiev of Richmond and Great Britain. And he also, I think, followed the legacy of Vladika St. John in greatly encouraging the small but significant number of converts to Orthodoxy, many of whom from Anglicanism or Roman Catholicism, to again dedicate themselves to learning about the lives of the British saints, and to again start to develop authentic Orthodox veneration for these saints. And it's here that I think mention should also be made of the St. Seraphim Brotherhood in Walsingham, and the importance of Archimandrite David Mayrick, who established in the former railway station in Walsingham a very beautiful Russian Orthodox church dedicated to St. Seraphim of Sarov. I don't know if many of you have been to Walsingham and seen the railway chapel, but it's a very beautiful place. And for many decades, from I think the 1960s, through to, I think, the 1980s, 90s. Archimandrite David, together with Brother Leon, they were both icon painters. They spent a great deal of their time writing icons to the British saints, and in particular to the Celtic saints, if you like, of these lands. That was, if you like, a particular charism they had. And also within the Brotherhood, there were also, it was also encouraged to write hymnography to the British saints. And here I've got a copy of the kind of the Troparion Kontakia of many of the British saints that was compiled by the St. Seraphim Brotherhood and published in Walsingham. And alongside the Troparion Kontakia that were composed, and again, my godfather, Deacon Andrew Bond, he was, again, one of the liturgical composers for that collection. And they also composed canons in honor of the saints. So I think a very significant contribution was made by the St. Seraphim Brotherhood, and with their the St. Seraphim calendar that was published annually as a counterpart really to the St. Herman's calendar, which some of you may also receive, they were able to list the dates of many of the British saints for new, both, if you like, cradle Orthodox as well as new converts to Holy Orthodoxy, to start commemorating the saints in their daily prayers. And again, raising the consciousness, I think, of the Church to the existence of these saints, and through having icons beginning to give visual material form to the saints that in many cases have sadly vanished, whereby, you know, both the relics, the iconography, the holy places, the churches, the sanctuaries, in many cases being destroyed, but again, through the prayerful iconography of Father David as well as Brother Leon, again, through the darkness, we began to see again the form and the shape of so many of these British saints. Also, and again, it'd be interesting to hear perhaps later on a little more from Reader Anthony, but I know in terms of your own writing, Reader Anthony, that you've composed many troparia to the British saints, as well as stichera as well. And so there's, again, a lot of material for people to use. And we have, I note that there are a good number of saints for whom you have written a troparia Kontakia as well as some stichera. The former Archpriest Andrew Phillips, whose website Orthodox England and journal Orthodox England has also been a very important repository for articles and information on the British saints of the first millennia. And I also particularly recommend, if you haven't seen it, I don't know if you can see them. There we go. His book, little book, Gazetteer, The Hallowing of England. You can get it quite cheaply on Amazon. And he, through that book and through his writing more generally, very much encourages Orthodox Christians to go and seek out the places, the holy places attached to the saints of Old England. I think it's right to say that Andrew Phillips developed a particular interest in the Anglo-Saxon saints, or the saints of Old England. I think in more recent times, I think he started to develop more of an interest to some of the Celtic saints, but I think that was partly counterbalancing some of the, if you like, Celtic bias that could be detectable within the St. Seraphim Brotherhood. And I think to a large extent complements that very well. Andrew Phillips was responsible for composing the services to St. Audrey, St. Felix, St. Edmund, and St. Alfred. There's some controversy about St. Alfred, but we can talk about that later, as well as a more general service to the Saints of the Isles to be celebrated on the, well, the second or the third Sunday after Pentecost, according to which rubric you follow. But by far, as we found really in compiling this index of the liturgical materials to the British saints, by far the biggest contributor has been monk Joseph Lambertson, known, perhaps more popularly known before he became a monk, as Reader Isaac Lambertson. Monk Joseph, or Reader Isaac, composed, well, hundreds of services actually to the saints of Western Europe, more universally, and translated a great deal of services and akathists and prayers and texts from the Trebnik. But he is responsible for, as a composer, for 68 services to the British saints. Again, I think the vast majority of them are Old English or Anglo-Saxon saints, but there are also some services to many of the very important Celtic saints, as well as some which are lesser known. Monk Joseph's services are of very high quality. They're very formally composed. They also use some lesser known special melodies. Maybe I know that Father Kirill is something of a liturgical musical expert, so maybe he knows some of these special melodies, but most of them are very unfamiliar to me. But yes, he composed very beautiful formal services to the saints, but in the vast majority of cases, these are simple services. That is, they have the absolute minimum of liturgical texts to celebrate an evening service, that's the service of Vespers, as well as the service of Matins and a liturgy to the saints. Yes, even for some of the great saints like St. Columba, for example, of Iona, he hasn't composed as you might think he might, a full vigil service. Instead, we have just a simple service, so the bare minimum. So again, as you can actually download this on the diocese website, but I think so far, or when we did our last update on the website, I think we had found 85 services to the British saints. There is, of course, far more liturgical material than that, if you count individual troparia, cantacia, canons, and akathists. Then I guess we're probably heading into the low hundreds. But in terms of full services, or that at least are composed of a complete service of Vespers, as well as Matins and liturgy, where that's been completed, we counted about 85. That's gone up very slightly. I've very recently found been given a draft of a service to St. Richard that's in the process of being finalized at the moment. And I also was sent from America through the appeal that we launched on the back of publishing the list of the services that we had discovered so far. I also made contact with a few other people in America who have sent me some services that they've written to some other saints as well. So we will, again, continue to expand the index as we receive more of those services. So in some ways, the collation, although it's a long-term and ambitious project, in some ways that's the kind of the easy bit. The much more difficult bit, I think, are these later phases. So first of all, if you like, editing the liturgical materials, as well as authoring these lives of the saints. So I'm just going to deal now with some of the problems that kind of we're beginning to encounter when it comes to looking through the extant liturgical materials to the British saints. So one of the immediate problems that faces us is this problem of liturgical language. There's very strong views on liturgical language, it's fair to say, throughout the Orthodox Church. This not just extending to the use of thee and thou, as opposed to you and your, but also going into how the Mother of God is referred to, whether it's Theotokos or birth giver of God or mother of God. Also a kind of what ideal, if you like, of liturgical language is placed as that which liturgical composers should aspire towards. And as the, if you like, the King James version of the Bible is seen as being a masterpiece of liturgical English, and in some ways to be, if you like, the English equivalent of the, as it were, the formality and the poetry, perhaps, of Church Slavonic. Many liturgical authors, including Monk Joseph, Reader Isaac, very much looked to that kind of Elizabethan form of language as being the liturgical ideal when it came to hymnographical composition. But again, that in itself raises some problems, particularly when it comes, well, when it comes to actually reading these texts out. That can often make them a bit of a mouthful. And there are some people have questioned whether in aspiring towards this ideal of liturgical English, something is lost when it comes to the smoothness or even if you like, the authenticity of the language and the mood, the feeling that's evoked in reading in that kind of formal English. Some people have, for example, accused it of sounding a bit ye olde worldy, a bit fake. Again, I'm not necessarily posing a view on that, but simply illustrating that this is a problem when it comes to trying to standardize liturgical English. Another approach to liturgical English was taken by Father Lazarus Moore, that some of you may have come across, a very brilliant monastic and liturgical translator who translated many spiritual works and liturgical works, many of which actually have been either unpublished or out of print. But his translation of the Jordanville Prayer Book, which is published by the St. George Orthodox Information Service, is often seen as another classic of liturgical English, which still retains thee and thou, but dispenses with perhaps some of the more obscure, shall we say, parts of the liturgical idiom of the 17th century. So the them, that's, the use of dost and doth, for example, become slightly modernized and perhaps smoother or more familiar in so doing. So there's obviously a problem here around liturgical English, and maybe some of you have got some good ideas about how this can, ways forward around this and how it can be standardized. I'd be very interested to hear that a little bit later on. There's also a problem of the hagiography itself. And this is going to be a real problem when it comes to, I forget the phase now, is it phase 4 of the project that Vladika has given us when it comes to authoring these simple lives of the saints. In many cases, as I've kind of discovered through compiling this index of liturgical material for each of the British saints that I come across, I'm now trying to find out what are the hagiographical sources that we have about these saints. And it's really struck me how in the vast majority of cases, we lack contemporary or anywhere near contemporary hagiographical sources. And in many, and in fact, in the vast majority of cases, we're dependent upon later medieval Norman at the earliest, and usually post-Norman conquest sources. And this means that we're dependent upon sources that ultimately have not been written within the Orthodox Church, but within the Roman Catholic Church, or perhaps, and and they're also themselves removed by 400, 500, maybe 600 years or more from the the subjects, the saints that they are actually writing about. And that then raises the whole problem about how much credence we give to these later medieval sources. And that's particularly difficult when we have no other sources to actually go upon. So St. David, for example, who on the old calendar we celebrate today, again, we have no contemporary lives of St. David. And again, I think the earliest source we have is from the 11th century, again, and thus removed by 500-600 years from when St. David was around. So again, how uncritically do we approach these hagiographies when they've been written outside the Orthodox Church, and in some cases have material which can be said to be problematic, fanciful, or perhaps romantic. Just one, to give one example of one approach, Father Elias Jones, I don't know if many of you have heard of him, but he was a priest in ROCOR, and also, again, had been received by Father David, so comes out of that Walsingham kind of ROCOR foundation. But he also became a kind of a very great historian in his own right. He wrote a book, which I'm holding here, which is, sorry, not very good at, there we go, the English Saints. This was going to be a multi-volumed work. I think he only completed this first volume to the East Anglian Saints, but I know that he had notes and drafts that I've seen to the Saints of Cornwall, which I know that he was writing. But he took quite a radical stance, and surprising stance indeed, to the hagiographical material about some of the British saints. So, and I say surprising stance in the sense that, for example, to give one example, in this book, he talks about St. Wolstan, who is very much a local saint to East Anglia. Maybe Botolph has heard of him. He laboured in a place just outside Norwich, a place called Barbara. And essentially he was a prince or of local royal stock, and then undertook something of the life of a holy fool, really, exchanging his kind of regal crown, as it were, to become a simple farm labourer, which is how he lived out his remaining days in great humility. However, Father Elias in this book very much, if you like, was strongly influenced by a lot of the ultimately kind of secular historical critiques of some of this hagiographical material. And even though Father Elias himself composed a supplicatory canon to St. Wolstan, and I know was actually very involved in the veneration of St. Wolstan and the painting of an icon to him, it's very greatly surprised me to find that in his book, Father Elias actually suggests that the St. Wolstan was not a historically verifiable saint, and essentially concludes that he was a mythological. He also had the same view about Our Lady of Walsingham, which also surprised me, because I know that he was for many years the shrine priest at Walsingham. So that may be a kind of a little eccentric example, but again, it raises the problem about how do we approach these hagiographical materials, particularly when, you know, secular commentators can often be very strident in their critique, or in what they might call demythologizing a lot of this material, dismissing accounts of miracles and anything which seems remotely kind of superstitious. How are we as Orthodox to actually make sense of this and come to a balanced approach upon it? Another problem that is also apparent when it comes to looking at services to the British saint is the fact that, curiously, so many of the important British saints fall rather awkwardly in the Lenten Triodion, as well as the early Pentecostarian. So that's basically, so we've just kind of entered into this past Sunday, the first Sunday of Lent, and we are now heavily into the Lenten Triodion, and all the services are largely dictated by the Triodion, which has huge amounts of hymnography each day, and this in many cases entirely supplants, overrides any individual commemoration there is of a British saint. There's also the problem that during the week there can be no liturgies served in Great Lent, and the only services that can be served, as it were, are the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts. So this creates some problems when it, again, as Orthodox, when it comes to trying to promote the integration of the liturgical materials we have, the British saints, into our worshipping liturgical lives, if so many of those saints, so just to give a few examples, that's St. David, St. Edward, St. Chad, St. Cuthbert, and also in April, St. Guthlac, again, some really significant saints are caught up in this time of, which can sometimes be, fall very awkwardly during Holy Week, or again, during days when there's no liturgy called for. So again, it creates some problems. These aren't necessarily problems that can't be overridden, but they make a situation that is already difficult that much more complex. There are some solutions when it comes to perhaps finding a translation feast, a secondary feast, that perhaps can become the major ranking feast rather than the feast that might fall during this March, April time of the year, which can often get caught up in the Lent to and into the Paschalian kind of cycle. But yes, that can really create some problems. Incidentally, in the Anglo-Saxon and Celtic Church, as far as I'm aware, there was no prohibition when it came to serving Mass, as it would have been certainly within the Old English Church, during Great Lent. Again, if we look at the liturgical calendars, the Anglo-Saxon liturgical calendars, we can certainly see that they have full ranking services going throughout Lent. So it just wasn't a problem really for our forebears, but again, for us as Orthodox, inheriting essentially a Byzantine approach and framework for how services are put together, this is really difficult. This is complicated. Another issue we found when we were looking through the index of the saints was the kind of disparity in some of the liturgical materials, which I think was understandable, but again, causes some problems. So to give one example, that one of the services to St. Romwald, who was, again, you may or may not have heard of, was a child saint of only, I think, a few days old before he reposed, but had a kind of miraculous short life that included reciting, I think, the Creed in Latin, as I recall, miraculously in the first few days of his life. So St. Ronwald was a child saint. He's in the Anglo-Saxon calendars, and an Orthodox layman who is named after St. Romwald, in his enthusiasm for his namesake, wrote a full vigil service to St. Romwald, which is very good. But again, as I mentioned earlier, if St. Columba or even St. David, who are, or St. David is like a patron saint of Wales, St. Columba, one of the greatest of the Celtic saint, so far in terms of our liturgical index, only has the most basic and simple liturgical provision. If saints of that magnitude, very high-ranking saints, have only very basic hymnography, complete hymnography, it seems rather strange that we also then have St. Rumwald, who I think it's fair to say is a fairly lesser known Orthodox saint, has a full vigil length service, which would encompass, a full all-night vigil and liturgia and so on and so forth. So again, there's this problem also about how do we ascribe the appropriate weight of veneration to the services as we compile them and edit them. How are we actually going to balance out which saints should hold a vigil rank, which saints should be a slightly lower rank? Again, the church within the Russian liturgical tradition, again, has different ranks of saint according to, and it also has an impact upon what you can actually do, usually kind of how extensive the vigil service would be, in particular before the liturgy. So I know we're coming close to the end of time, so I will try and end with some concluding thoughts, and then would be keen to have questions or thoughts, observations, and actually any solutions that you might have to any of these knotty problems that we're coming across as we investigate the liturgical materials of the British saints. So the first thing is that I think that I'm hoping that the saints will in some way inspire us and show us a way forward. And I think that particularly when it comes to trying to interpret and reconcile the bewildering kind of hagiographical materials about the lives of the saints and how we're supposed to come to some kind of appropriate balanced view about what is true, I think that we should wait for the saints, to some extent, the saints themselves to lead us and to show us and lead us into the truth. I think in many ways, I've just seen, even just within the time that I've been Orthodox, I've heard of new Anglo-Saxon monasteries and foundations being discovered archaeologically. Relics have been returned. New Orthodox pilgrimages and annual pilgrimages are being founded and encouraged. There are now lives to the British saints that have been translated into Russian. There's a particularly prominent author of these lives who writes on pravoslavny.ru, Orthodox Christian website, and has translated many of those lives into Russian, as well as helping converts like myself to appreciate fully the legacy of the Orthodox saints of these isles. So I think that we need to make sure that essentially we become local level experts in the saints that flourished in the lands, the places around which we are connected to. And maybe this is an important first step that we can all do. We can all find out more, learn more, become more informed about the Orthodox saints who labored in the first millennium in the places where we happen to be, where God has led us. And we can, or if we go on holiday, we can perhaps dedicate, and whether that's in the British Isles or whether that's maybe in Europe or wherever, we can perhaps dedicate one of those days to having a pilgrimage with our families. And again, preparing for that pilgrimage properly. So finding out, what are the lives of the saints, seeing what liturgical materials we can find. Is there an icon we can take with us? And when we go to those places, ensuring that we spend some time in prayer to the saints. And in that way, we can develop those living links to the saints of these isles. I think also the importance of writing new icons to the British saints. Again, something that's really struck me through compiling the index is just how many of the saints sadly have no icon that I'm aware of or have been able to find. And again, so we need more icons to be commissioned and more parishes to have icons again of the local saints that surround them. And when we have children, although my children are called Mary and George, so I can't really speak with any authority perhaps on this, but I think it's a good thing when I discover Albans or Botolphs, for example, as Robert's Orthodox name, I know is. So I think it's a very good thing for us to take on the names of the saints around that laboured before us in these isles. And again, if we're looking for new names for our children, or if we're going to perhaps sponsor people into the church, that perhaps we encourage them to look at those names. And yes, like I was saying, really, I do think that the saints of these isles are in some ways making contact with us and are leading us in some sense. And there's a very nice story, for example, about St. Botolph of Icon, and that, for example, that Robert's name saint in Suffolk, there was a lot of controversy for many years about where Icon or Iconhoe was, and there was a local tradition that it was in Icon in Suffolk, but for many years this was contested, and there was another rival site proposed in Boston. And then through an apparent tragedy, which was that the church at Icon in Suffolk burnt down, and the locals there who had a local belief, if you like, an oral tradition that this was the Iconhoe of St. Botolph, were obviously distraught about their beloved church burning down. But in the process, they found in the foundations, they found a part of an ancient Anglo-Saxon standing cross was built into the foundations, which were only exposed through the fire. And through doing this, along with kind of textual scholarship, they established that St. Botolph was truly from Icon in Suffolk and was not from Lincolnshire, as some people were alleging. So again, I think that's just one little example about ways in which I believe that the saints of these isles are in touch with us today and are leading us into the truth, slowly revealing the truth of who they are. But I think so much depends upon us cultivating real relationships with them, becoming friends with our local saints. And this in itself, this friendship and this love, this devotion, this in itself will lead, I think, to the cultivation of and the composition of new services, the writing of new icons, and perhaps a new generation who themselves will find themselves in a church that is surrounded by the saints of these isles through the holy icons, and with services once again to these wonderful and beautiful saints of these isles. So I think I'll finish on that note. I'm sure I've gone over the time, but I'm really be interested in questions, observations, comments, and any solutions you might have. So I will shut up now and pass the floor back over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leap straight in with a question, two questions actually. The first one is where are you drawing the line? What are the cutoff points? Are you taking 1054 or some other date? And how are you, I mean, in an age before people could be canonized or glorified, how are you determining who definitely is a saint? And the second thing was brought to mind actually by the Botolph reference. I know that there are hymns written by the monastery at Boston in America that refer expressly to Boston, Lincolnshire as his home. How do you deal with things like that turn out to be inaccurate?
Yes, some really good questions there. So, yeah, so that's actually a problem that, again, another problem that we didn't really go into, but one that you're quite right about, which is, yeah, how do you determine who is definitely a saint? And again, the dates you mentioned, so 1066, kind of the Norman conquest. So that's often seen as one date that's given, in the sense of it's the date at which, again, there's been a lot of controversy about when it was exactly that even the kind of, as it were, ordinary parishes in the early medieval West would have even known that they were no longer in communion with the rest of the Orthodox Church, even though they were perhaps continuing for many years the same services, and certainly prior to the Norman Conquest would have been expounding the same faith. So yes, I think let's start that again. I suppose we haven't as such come to any firm resolution on that. I think we probably would lean to the 1066 Norman Conquest cutoff date, in the sense that whilst 1054 was of course the Great Schism and when it was formalized, I think it is reasonable to say that there was a transitional period for some time. And indeed, I think that I've read articles that was actually questioning when exactly, if you like, the Great Schism was actually properly realized and felt within kind of early medieval churches. So I think that 1066 is a little bit safer, and it also enables us to ensure that Walsingham remains in the places of which can be firmly connected as Orthodox centres. So yes, I suppose we would lean to 1066, and I think that would be fairer, because from that period there was certainly the imposition of a Frankish Norman version of Christianity, shall we say, that had some distinct predilections and emphases and theological approaches which differed from certainly the faith as expounded by many of the Old English and Celtic saints. As for your second question about Boston, I think essentially that is going to be whereby, now that I think there is really quite significant consensus that Icon and Suffolk, as opposed to somewhere in Lincolnshire, is the proper location for St. Botolph's monastery, that simply, I think, liturgical materials which have, references to Boston will just need to be edited, I think, if we have the permission of the composers, which I think in that case it was the Holy Transfiguration Boston monastery that were the composers of that service. So if they give their permission for that, we would seek to update it. If not, again, that might then become a service that needs to be rewritten in some way.
Can I chip in? You talk about the lives of the saints. Are you making use of the work of Father John Muster, for instance, among your sources?
Yeah, I've come across Father John's book. Yes, I have.
And there's a lot more on his website, I think, of stuff that is.
Yes, I'm familiar with that. Yeah, that's very, very helpful.
Yeah.
And good for pilgrimage, actually, as I recall, kind of identifying where these sites are and wells and all sorts of things.
Yeah. Then the other topic, of course, is talk about music. Orthodox services are, in principle, sung.
Yep.
Stichera are to be sung. Where's the tunes?
Yeah.
Big gap in your plan of things. Where's the music?
Yep. So that's another problem. So some of the services, for example, there's actually, I think, 4 or 5 services that were composed by, I want to get his name right, it's Father David. One second, let me just find his name. Yes, Father David Somalis. And he wrote some full vigil services to about 5 or 6 British saints, including St. Cuthbert, St. David, trying to think who else he did, St. Alban, I think, and wrote full services, but again, those were written in Byzantine hymnography. Yeah. The other service I referred to, St. Richard of Wessex, that pilgrim saint whose relics are in Italy, that is being written by another American convert to Orthodoxy, but it again is written against a Byzantine hymnographical framework. That's also going to be really tricky, because obviously when they say such and such hymnography is in tone 3 or mood 3, that will be very different according to whether you're singing this in Russian or according to the Russian or Greek hymnographical traditions, musical traditions.
Depends on whether it's Podoban or whether it's an idiomel. I think that's one of the differences. If it's an idiomel, yes, there will be a full Byzantine chant for it. If it's a Podoban, then you can simply, in the Russian tradition, you can simply adapt it to the one of the Russian melodies for that particular form. So that's problematic. But if it's idiomel, then you need a nice harmony chant for it to match the Byzantine. That's not difficult.
Well, yeah. So, but that's another problem when it comes also to this being helpful for wider parishes. I mean, obviously, Monk Joseph or Reader Isaac composed all his services against a strict kind of Russian hymnographical tradition. So again, if you're part of a community that uses kind of a more Byzantine Ustav or kind of a liturgical approach, then again, there's another process of translation that's required there.
But yeah, I work in the Russian musical tradition, and adapting or with using translations to Podoban is great fun. And so it's not impossible. It can be done. So. But you need to, when you're writing the text, you need to be aware of what the model melody or the model verse has. Which bits get duplicated. Do you have the same first line every verse, or a very similar first line every verse? Do you have the same last line every verse, last 2 lines, last 3 lines, or very similar lines? Are there internal structures that need to be matched? If you get that right, then we can sing them.
That's right.
That needs to be taken into account in composing. You can't write verse to be sung without the music.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point, Father.
Out of interest, have you come across anything that you think is just not particularly good and we might be better off starting again? I'm not suggesting name or shame.
Yes, I mean, I
yes,
think
mine.
Did you say?
Yes, mine.
No, not at all. But yes, there's certainly I've been sent when the appeal for liturgical material kind of was put on the website. I was sent some interesting, shall we say, material, which again, the one I'm particularly thinking about is clearly being written with a great deal of personal love and devotion. But again, kind of going back to your point, Father Kirill, shall we say, there was a lack of rigor, I think, when it came to appreciation, if you like, of liturgical structure and hymnography. So again, that's all going to impact upon its usability and how we can easily kind of incorporate that formally into what we're doing and what we're.
I do quail at the Tropariat and Cantacia that insist on being a travelogue of the saint's entire life. Because if you look at the ones to the established ones to the saints in the Millennium, traditionally they're not like that. They will make perhaps one reference to the saint's life, and a lot of them are actually quite short.
Yes, no, you're quite right. I think some of our most ancient Troparia, I'm thinking like the ones to the Apostles Peter and Paul, again, is very, very short, for example.
And some of the great saints have Troparia that are in fact not specific to them. They're general ones that are just used for that saint, however great.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of saints that kind of have.
That's right.
This is Tropar, like the general Tropar, as it were, for a hierarch. Yeah. Yeah, you're quite right. I've noticed that very much from reading a lot of the services that, there are some hymnographers. And I'd actually say my own godfather, actually, so I have to be careful what I say, but I know Father Deacon Andrew is quite a fan of, shall we say, using the canon to actually give a short précis of the life. He justifies that for missionary or kind of educational purposes, but you're quite right. If you actually look at the kind of traditional structure of the canons, in general terms, there will be obviously references to the lives of the saints. In very broad terms, there might be a bare chronology there from Ode 1 through to Ode 9. But in many cases, the subject of the Troparia within the canon will resonate more with the Irmos.
Yes, sure.
The biblical ode, the biblical theme, if you like, and we'll use that as the conceit, if you like. It will resonate on the biblical theme, if you like, for the wider ode, as opposed to constructing, as it were, a biographical narrative of the saint. So yes, I think you're quite right.
One of the things you mentioned in passing, and Robert has also picked it up. Oh, I've got an echo. Is the use of text for pilgrimage. So some of the ones that I authored many years ago was in the context of an annual get-together and pilgrimage we had in Devon, which Father John Marks used to organise in Peterscora, to 3 local cultus sites, St Nectan, St Urith of Chittlehampton, and so on. And the texts were therefore for that cultic purpose. And at the time I was reading quite deeply into the lives of several of the saints, from which I learned several things. One, it's extraordinary the number of saints who sailed across from South Wales to the southwest of Britain on their altar stones. Or tombstones. It's remarkable also the number of women saints who were accompanied by white domestic animals. The number also who had horrible things done to them and springs gushed forth at that very spot, which led me to reflect on the fact that a lot of these, just as we talk about general Kontakia and general Troparia, a lot of these lives were general lives. And that probably the reason for that was also liturgical. If you were celebrating the Latin Church Matins in the night, there were readings from the lives of the saints. So you needed to have lives of the saints. So duty monk was commissioned to prepare one. And if there was not much detail or scarcely any of the saints' life, then you got the generic one. And I think a lot of these lives that are difficult to justify historiographically are in fact generic for that purpose. And they've acquired local folkloric add-ons. And if you're talking about being careful about how you read the lives of the saints, I think it's quite important to look at why they were written at all. Because not every saint did have one. So therefore, why do some saints have them and not others? And it'd be worth researching into what the local cultus of a saint was. You mentioned Alfred the Great, and yes, he is in some people's calendars. But as far as I'm aware, there was never any historical cultus of Alfred.
Quite right. Yes.
And a lot of the saints who appear terminable lists, Welsh and Cornish saints, are there because they're in somebody's place name somewhere.
Yes.
And it's been extracted from the place name, and there's no local cultus at all. And I'm not sure what it tells us to do that. If there's evidence of a cultus, that's a different matter. And that's perhaps where research could be useful. But even then, the most you will get for many saints is the knowledge of when the local patronal ale day was, which tells you roughly where the saint's date was on the calendar. And that was the nature of the cultus in many cases. And which leads one to ask the question, and I think it is a valid question, if we as 21st century Orthodox Christians go digging about in our own history, and dragging out people who nobody's heard of for 1500 years and insisting that saints, that full services are written to these people and that people have to listen to them. I think we need to think why we are doing it. I'm not saying that some of them shouldn't be done, but I really do think we have to be aware of over-enthusiasm, of doing it for the sake of doing it. For many saints on the Greek and the Russian calendar, they are no more than a commemoration. They're commemorated in the blessing prayer at the end.
In Orthodox Matins, you do have the lives of the saints read if you do the service in full with the Synaxarion.
With the Synaxarion, yes.
You should have an introductory line, on this day we commemorate so-and-so. Then you may have the life of the saint, but a lot of them you don't. You just have we commemorating, I think it might be 10, 15, 20 on a particular day. Where just the name is mentioned, nothing else. So that would be a sort of equivalent thing there. The other thing to say is my work of translating, retranslating a lot of the services. A lot of the Menaeon texts are turgid, not very good.
Yeah, they're grim, aren't they?
Yeah, some of them. Some of them livened up. You got whoever wrote playing with puns, particularly punning on saints' names and their meaning in Greek.
That's Board's Duty Monk. That's Board's Duty Monk. That is.
Yeah, whoever wrote them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you made some really interesting points there, Anthony. I think I think it's really important that, again, that there is that living relationship that essentially, and I agree with you. I think just, if you like, creating services kind of artificially as a kind of almost as an academic exercise doesn't feel quite right. I think there has to be some kind of living, warm relationship as the basis for that devotion.
You were talking about the saints.
Organic devotion.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
One thing I would put in terms of commemorating saints, major saints, when there is no divine liturgy, or you're within a fasting season, or whatever such thing. We used, when people were younger and more agile and more devoted to these things, we would attend the Anglican pilgrimage to Glastonbury each year, carry an icon of the Mother of God in the procession, but we would go to the undercroft of the Norman chapel and sing a prayer service to the saints of Glastonbury. And you can sing a prayer service to the saint, I would have thought, almost any time.
Yes, that's very true. Kind of molebens or ecclesias, or absolutely. I suppose this kind of as it were, para-liturgical services are not a problem, but I think it's one of the kind of frustrations and kind of tragedies I felt was the way in which there was no parity within our formal liturgical calendars given to the British saints, if you like, alongside Byzantine, Russian, or wherever kind of saints, or ancient kind of Roman saints that have come the liturgical cycles of the church.
But also think about the fact that within the calendar, on the general calendar, there are mostly saints of the early centuries that are everybody's. You then have the Russian local calendar, which has more Russian saints, the Greek one, which has more Greek saints on it. The medieval English calendars would have more commemoration of English saints than, say, the Church in France would. So you have local lists, and that's not difficult to do. In England, you might keep a different list from you would in Ireland, for instance. There are many Irish saints who have local cultus in Ireland who people in England have no knowledge of, because
there are millions of them.
Yes. So I think horses for courses.
Absolutely. In fact, just for January the 1st, I think I found something like 26 Celtic saints just for January the 1st.
Yes.
my research so far. So, but again, like you're saying though, Anthony, in many cases, all we have in terms of these saints might be a place name, it may be the name of a church, it may be a holy well, but we have no other information whatsoever, and that makes it very problematic, very difficult to know what to do.
Yes, which is why I've made a note here of beware of antiquarianism, but do rely on adequate scholarship. Yeah,
absolutely. And actually, you know, I mentioned, I think, Sabine Baring-Gould, whose researches are, you know, been very, very indeed. There's also, I'm trying to think of his name now, but there's compiler of the lives of the Irish saints who did a kind of a similar thing. Well, I suppose Sabine Baring-Gould also kind of covered the Irish saints as well, but did a very exhaustive, though unfinished, sadly, collection of the lives of the Irish saints. So yeah, I think a lot of that kind of 19th century scholarship, you know, is really, really valuable still. But yeah, absolutely. I think you still got to be careful though about just, you know, from that, just then constructing artificially out of nowhere some kind of full service. Yeah.
Yes, indeed so. One of the things probably to work towards is some sort of supported and researched calendar of at least saints whose existence you're reasonably sure of and whose local cultus is verifiable. That would probably be quite well worth doing.
Yes. What I'm trying to do in the index is for each saint kind of indicate what the kind of what it's like the essentially, you know, what archaeological, hagiographical, kind of literary kind of works and testimony that we have historically, if you like, for them as a real existing figure, and then also just indicating as we go through. I think it'd be interesting to begin to explore, you know, what the state of that hagiography is, and again the extent to which we can actually discern some kind of life of the saint through that. But I think, like I was trying to indicate, I do think that, and do believe really, that, you know, that the saints themselves will make themselves manifest, I think.
I also think that far more has been made than ever should have been about the differences between the so-called Celtic observances and the Roman ones.
Absolutely.
Somehow Celtic saints are better than Saxon ones, you know.
Am I right? And again, those who are more venerable than I am, I'm sure may well know this, but am I right in thinking that Archimandrite Barnabas was, if you like, responsible for that kind of view that the...
He wasn't alone in it.
No, certainly not. But I think he was, one of the fierce proponents of that view that, you know, certainly a suspicion of the Roman saints. So any of the saints, you know, associated with the Roman mission were kind of proto-Roman Catholic.
And this is it. That somehow the Synod of Whitby was rather like
1064 Synod of Whitby. The cutoff, almost like the Great Schism.
Yes.
Point.
And that's nonsense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And actually, I think, that view I did see reflected in the St. Seraphim Brotherhood. I think actually held something of that view, and I think that was perhaps partly behind their kind of Celtic tendency, or their particularly Celtic interests. And so they, as far as I'm aware, they did relatively few kind of icons and services to a lot of the Old English Anglo-Saxon saints, and saints like St. Bede, for example, they gave very little kind of to.
Oh, the great Bede.
Sadly.
Do you remember the early days of the Orthodox Outlook magazine?
Yes, I do. Yeah, Father Athanasius.
Have you seen their...
I can't quite see that. Sorry, what is that? No, I haven't seen that.
There was a supplement to one of the editions of it, a calendar of the Orthodox saints of the British Isles. Shall I photocopy it and send it to you?
Oh, that would be great. Thank you. Actually, I should also say that if any of you have anything connected to the British saints, that even if you think it might be useful, I just really appreciate you getting in contact and me know about it, because I'm sure that, yeah, lots of you will have various bits and bobs about local saints that maybe you found out about or know something about. And I'm sure that through that can all contribute and help to what is going to be a monumental.
Several lifetimes.
I think absolutely several lifetimes. I don't suspect that I'm going to, well, I hope that I will live to see something come out of this, but yeah, it's going to take a long time.
Yes.
I don't know if there are any last questions.
Given the,
where we've overrun.
Given the scale of the work, you're undertaking, you might be better off hoping that you'll just get to meet them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got a slightly more light-hearted question. Have you made any sort of particular discovery? Someone who was unknown to you but is now a bit of a favourite?
Oh, that's quite a difficult one. Well, actually, a recent saint that I mentioned was St. Richard of Wessex.
Yes.
I only, again, very recently came across him.
I have a godson dedicated to him.
Oh, okay, wonderful. And yeah, it was, well, there's two things that happened. And again, kind of it follows up what I was saying sometimes about, in some ways, the saints, I think, make themselves known to us. So I was sent a copy of a very small icon by, I've forgotten his surname now, but George Ioannis, is it? George Ioannis, who's an iconographer who's written recently a iconographic manual to the British saints. I don't know if some of you have seen this. He's basically, I've got it in the other room. I could go and get it if there's time, but essentially he's an iconographer. I'm sure it's George Ioannis, I'm sure is his name. And he's essentially done drawings to a lot of the British saints for each day of the year. And it's quite a thick book. Wow. And he's kind of, again, researched as well as he could the lives and tried to reflect details, kind of visually and symbolically in each of his icons to the saints. And along with his copy of that book, he sent me a small icon of St. Richard of Wessex. And I thought, oh, I've never really heard of St. Richard of Wessex. So I then went and read something. And then lo and behold, a few days later, someone called Richard kind of heard that I was involved in this British Saints project and said that he was compiling a full service to St. Richard and sent it to me. So I thought, right, well, it's clearly St. Richard is a saint I need to learn more about. And so I've now got the icon in my icon corner and yeah, just starting to cultivate something of a relationship with St. Richard, who incidentally, again, I don't know huge amounts about him, but as I recall, what I have learned essentially was a king in Wessex who shortly after converting to Orthodoxy, like many of our saintly and pious Orthodox kings of this country, then kind of essentially gave up his throne and essentially went on pilgrimage. And I think he was going on pilgrimage to Rome, but sadly he died on the way, and his relics are venerated in one of the villages in I think northern Italy. I'm trying to remember the name of the place, but I can't quite. But yes, and are still there to this day. That's another thing in itself, actually, again, the tragedy that so few of our British saints still have relics that we're able to venerate.
Well, I was going to say what would be worth doing is, as well as a calendar for the year, is a saints list of those whose relics do survive. There are a number, and the location of where those relics are, because that would be quite useful.
I've also recently learned, I don't know if anyone's heard more or even perhaps been to visit, but the oratory in Oxford has a significant collection of small particles of saints of the British Isles. including some which I'm not aware there being any other relics claimed for the saint. Yeah, I'm also making kind of note of the ones that they claim to have. But again, that there are some legitimate questions sometimes around the authenticity, obviously, of relics and saint remains. So I didn't know if there are any last questions.
You've got questions on your list.
A frivolous question, perhaps. Do you find that with all the material that you have, that there is significant overlap? So various people have done the same work and produced verses to particular saints? And if so, how do you sift through, and how do you what do you do with all of those traparia that to the same saint?
Yes, is the answer. Not many cases, but there are definitely a few cases. So St. David is one. There is a service that was by monk Joseph, but also the Greek priest that I mentioned, Father David Somalis, has also written a full Greek Byzantine service, which is still in Greek, still needs to be translated into English. St. Edmund, so I was aware that Father Andrew Phillips had a full vigil service, but then I also found recently that monk Joseph Lambertson had also written a service to St. Edmund that I hadn't come across. So yes, so I think, but essentially, I think we'll have to kind of compare the services, I suppose, and it might be a case of where it's appropriate, perhaps some of the hymns could be substituted or augmented. It's not uncommon for there to be multiple canons as well to the saints, so whereby there can be 2 or sometimes 3 canons to some of the saints. So yeah, I'm sure hopefully we'll be able to find ways around that.
On this last Sunday on the new calendar, we celebrated St. Benedict of Nursia, who I know for a fact has at least 2 services and 2 traparia of some antiquity. So yeah, I think a number of saints do have more than one.
Yes, but unfortunately, most of the time we have no services, sadly. So
No.
it's quite a boon when there's more than one. But there's cases whereby we've got multiple traparia. But again, it's not uncommon for there to be multiple traparia, as you were saying, Anthony. So not a disaster. Could I end by just asking a quick question, unless there's any other final questions, but it'd be interesting also to find out kind of the saints that you venerate as a Bristol parish, kind of the saints that are dear to your parish. I'd be interested just to know.
Well, St. David for one. We
have an annual pilgrimage to St. David, to the little St. David's Chapel in Llantoni in Monmouthshire in the mountains, which we substituted for the original pilgrimage, which we only did once, to St. David's, which is one heck of a long journey there and back in a day, which we did once. And our then priest said, well, actually, there's a little chapel of St. David's I know in the Black Mountains. We could go there. And ever since then, we have. Us and surrounding parishes on the Saturday nearest following his day. I know that the parish in Devon has a considerable, still continues their hymns for St. Nectan, St. Urith, St. Brannock of Braunton. We ought to take more notice of St. Kena of Keynsham, next door to Bristol.
Yeah,
And Conger of Congsbury.
Probably Bristol. There aren't very many local saints. There's probably Bristol.
There's those 2.
There are 2 or 3, yeah.
Oh, Robert, plus your man on the hill.
St. Jordan.
St. Jordan, that's right.
Yeah, there is a tradition that St. Brendan came to Bristol, which is why we have Brandon Hill Park. I haven't yet been able to introduce full and regular veneration of St. Jordan of Bristol, although perhaps one day. We have, there's me obviously named for St. Botolph. We've got someone else named for cuff, but recently someone who's had a baby is giving the baby the name Bridget after St. Bridget of Kildare. So we've got a sort of a small private awareness of some of these saints as well.
That's great. That's really good.
We have a number of icons to Saints of Britain. Claudia Bear in our parish has painted an icon of St. David, which is in the church.
We've also got reproductions of some of Father David's from Walsingham.
Yes.
Some of his icons.
Yes, we have.
Tucked away in a cupboard most of the time.
But we have them. There are several that have been up in the church.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have, in the church, we have here, Botolph, and do we have Ainsworth of Folkestone?
Ainsworth of Folkestone, yes.
Yeah.
And Cholfrith we've got in the church as well,
Cholfrith.
haven't we? Cholfrith.
That's the reason why it was given to us, yeah.
Yeah, from Geoffrey.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yes, it's the answer to an extent.
We shall have to start marking his feast by having his icon out in the centre if ever it falls on a Sunday.
What, Jofrith?
Yes.
What date?
I cannot for the life of me remember.
Tut.
And then of course we've got St. Nino of Georgia in there as well.
We have, yes, other local saints, yes.
And who is very dear to many of our locals, I suspect.
Indeed so.
Right, it's gone 9. I've got to get up at 5:30 tomorrow, so I'm going to have to love and leave you, good people.
Okay.
Oh,
You stop the recording.